Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Sunday everybody. It's the weekend, so we normally have a foreign policy heavy video, and that's no different today. Let's kick off today's episode with EU-China developments. And first we need to go all the way back to last weekend, where at a EU summit session, European Union leaders committed to reducing the bloc's dependence on China and debated how to strike a balance between de-risking and cooperation in areas such as climate change. In a surprise to many commentators, however, and likely due to differences between countries such as France and Germany, with sizable business interests in China, the policy and language on China ended up being much softer than anticipated, causing some to call it a moderate diplomatic win for Beijing. Quote, PRC ambassador to the EU, Fu Tong, should be in line for a promotion given his success in softening the rhetoric towards the PRC, and Premier Li Qiang must be ecstatic that German Chancellor Scholz is basically parroting his comments on companies and de-risking. End quote. It's worth pausing and unpacking this point for a moment. Quote, toward the end of a news conference last Friday, at the conclusion of a meeting of EU leaders in Brussels, Scholz was asked to provide his definition of de-risking. What was extraordinary was that it echoed, almost word for word, the message that Chinese Premier Li Qiang had delivered in Berlin just days before to an audience of German CEOs. De-risking, Scholz and Li both said, was better left to companies. It was not the role of the state to tell firms where or where not to invest. Leaving aside the fact that telling firms where to invest is precisely what the Chinese state has been doing for years, it is not difficult to understand why Li made this argument in Germany. Li is worried that European governments could move in tandem with their partners in the G7 in placing new restrictions on trade and investment with China. It will be interesting to watch the transatlantic dynamic over the coming months. After embracing the European term de-risking, the Biden administration has had to watch as European leaders, such as Scholz, render it meaningless. End quote. So, what happened at the EU summit? Well, US-based media outlet Politico, citing unnamed EU diplomatic sources, wrote at the time that in the days leading up to the summit, some Western European governments tried to water down even further an, quote, already boring, end quote, statement, just to make sure they, quote, wouldn't piss off China, end quote, in the words of unnamed Eastern European diplomatic sources. The latest draft of the end of summit concluding statement was, quote, less hostile in its tone toward Beijing, end quote, compared with other recent statements coming from Brussels. Quote, we now have a problem where the European Commission President listens to the United States and the European Council President listens to China, end quote. In the end, the conclusions from the EU summit merely expressed that the European Union will reduce critical dependencies and de-risk and diversify where necessary, called on China to press Russia to stop the war in Ukraine, and expressed concern about growing tensions in the Taiwan Strait, while stressing a shared interest in stable relations. So a somewhat firm statement against China, but much softer than many had expected. It looked like a decent defensive win for Beijing. But then this week, something strange happened. This week, the EU's top foreign and security policy chief, Joseph Borrell, was due to arrive in China on the 10th of July for a bilateral, high-level strategic dialogue. But then, suddenly, and without explanation, the PRC side cancelled the trip. Several days after the cancellation on Wednesday, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbing expressed, quote, we welcome High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Borrell, to visit China at the earliest time convenient to both sides and are ready to maintain communication with the EU. End quote. This bizarre move has had many commentators and analysts scratching their head. Is there something political happening in Beijing, perhaps division or argument among top officials regarding what their EU policy should be? Is this a form of punishment for some real or perceived slight from the EU? Maybe the recent Dutch chip restrictions? Based on what we just covered, this seems unlikely. Popular geopolitical commentator Peter Zion, in a video post earlier this week, put the reason for the cancellation down to an explanation he often turns to. The system isn't functioning because too much power has been accumulated at the top. Perhaps this is the case, though it feels like a somewhat unsatisfying explanation. Premier Li Qiang, Foreign Minister Qin Gang, top diplomat Wang Yi, and EU diplomat Fu Cong, all in tight alignment with state media for weeks, maintained a unified narrative and policy approach in relation to the EU, which, as we just saw, may have seen some success with the bloc. Why the sudden cancellation of this EU summit now? Is it simply that, quote, China is completely incapable of governance, end quote, as Zion argued earlier this week? My argument, for what it's worth, is that the situation is a little bit more nuanced than that. I suspect, and this is just my personal opinion, so please take it with a grain of salt, that after its recent EU summit win, Beijing policymakers felt more empowered to attempt a more complex EU approach, that is, trying to further drive a wedge between the more hawkish actors within the EU and the more dovish ones, working with the latter and pushing back against the former. In the eyes of Beijing, Borrell represents a member of the former. Whether China can pull this off is another question. Commentary coming from Beijing this week suggests this kind of thinking. Quote, the disconnection among EU institutions, between EU member states and the EU itself, and the varying demands of member states towards China have constrained the EU's policy towards China, causing it to oscillate between coordination and disconnection. This not only provides opportunity for the United States to intervene, but also provides space for us to strive for a healthy and good Sino-European relationship. End quote. And this, quote, while the EU has been advocating multifaceted policy toward China by defining it simultaneously as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival, such a playbook is unacceptable to China. If the EU side believes that there are some areas like the climate change we could cooperate more, that cooperation could be smooth, but if we don't manage competition or the areas of confrontation, they could also affect the existing cooperation. End quote. However, the explanation for the Borrell trip cancellation could end up being much more simple and frankly pedestrian. UK-based Financial Times reports on Friday, citing European diplomatic sources, quote, in Brussels corridors, speculation is that Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang may have health issues since he's been out of public view for 10 days. End quote. Whatever the reason, we will continue to follow EU-China developments closely going forward. We all know that the world is going through a period of tremendous political and social change. Over a year ago, global energy markets changed forever. Europe, which had used its relationship with Russia to ensure the free flow of oil and natural gas at stable prices, has had to engage in the largest energy shift in generations, and at a continental scale. One of the outcomes of this shift has been the renewed serious consideration of greatly accelerated nuclear power investment. But where the most seismic changes are happening is in North America. This is where massive opportunity lies. Back in the 1990s, laws and regulations heavily restricted U.S. uranium exploration and mining. Today, the Financial Review states that the U.S. domestic uranium industry is limited to just one remaining commercial enrichment facility in New Mexico. However, incredibly, the U.S. is a massive consumer of uranium, one of the biggest in the world, and this trend is set to continue. Now, Washington has bipartisan consensus to remove these restrictions. Bringing back uranium supply chains to North America is seen now as a national security priority. The Biden administration wants congressional approval, allowing the Department of Energy to purchase $4.3 billion of domestic uranium conversion and enrichment, end U.S. reliance on Russia, and support a U.S. supply chain for existing and new advanced reactors. The $1.5 billion strategic uranium reserve would likely be rolled into this new program. With surging demand from Europe, China, and the US, uranium has entered a bull market. And today's video sponsor, Traction Uranium, provides investors with an incredible opportunity to take advantage of this historic shift. This is a very exciting pick. Traction Uranium is in the business of mineral exploration and the development of discovery prospects in Canada, the world's second largest uranium producer. Traction is exploring its 2 uranium deposits in the incredible locations of the Athabasca Basin of Saskatchewan at Key Lake South and Harty Bay, both in the heart of one of the world's most productive uranium mining districts. This place is called the Saudi Arabia of uranium, with about 20 times the average international purity. And Traction's technical advisor, Bowen Tan, a bit of a legend in the industry, was instrumental in the discovery of this deposit back in 1975. So they know what they are doing there. As Washington brings supply chains back to North America, it is here where the action will be, because currently there is no other known location on the continent that can meet the massive US demand. Traction has a great location, excellent leadership, and solid demand. Everything is ready and they will begin drilling soon. This is where the opportunity is for investors. The opportunity here is to build a position with the company before any drilling happens. The market currently has the company priced modestly. If drilling proves successful with positive uranium, then the stock will surge as the market reprices it and investors pour in. This is thus a speculation of sorts, some risk, but also the real possibility of very high returns. As such, for these investors with that sort of appetite, looking for these types of opportunities, Traction Uranium could make an excellent addition to a well-diversified portfolio. And now is the time. There is one more thing to cover too. 55% of the company is owned by the founders and strategic partners of the company. This is a very tight structure of investors who believe in the company, and the founders have their skin in the game. So, if you want to take advantage of these historic geopolitical and market shifts that we are living through now, Traction Uranium is an extremely exciting company to look into. We remember that all investment involves risk. This is not individual investment advice. Always speak to an investment professional before making any major investment. A big thank you to Traction Uranium for sponsoring this episode of China Update. Okay, we now return to our regular content, and unfortunately we need to end today's video on a rather morbid note. In a recently published article in the official journal of the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the China CDC Weekly reports that the suicide rate among 5 to 14-year-olds in China quadrupled between 2010 and 2021. During this 11-year period, the rate among that group increased from 0.2 to about 0.8 per 100,000 people. Also concerning is that after a period of modest decline from 2017 through 2021, the suicide rate for 15 to 24-year-olds surged at an annual rate of 19.6%. Quote, "These findings imply that the ongoing suicide prevention interventions implemented by the Chinese government may not adequately address the needs of all age groups." End quote. The report stressed that policymakers need to prioritize the development of suicide prevention programs for young people. Commentators argue that the pandemic and zero-COVID restrictions likely contributed to the surge in suicides in 2020 and 2021. Quote, "Numerous individuals encountered social isolation, apprehension of contracting the virus, persistent stress, and financial hardships during this period, all of which have been linked to an increased risk of suicide." End quote. Though zero-COVID has ended, some of these factors, like financial hardships, continue. As such, and sadly, these historically high levels of suicide among China's young people may, tragically, continue. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Sunday, and I will see you back for a new week of China Update starting tomorrow on Monday.